I'll convene the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee meeting for March 20th. We only have one item on the agenda, which is setting rates for both the wastewater and solid waste. There is no one here in the audience to speak on anything that are not on our agenda, but if there were, they would have the opportunity now. But we will go straight to the items that is listed on our agenda. Mr. Samario.
Yes, thank you. I will introduce the item. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So we come to the Finance Committee every year about this time in advance of sending out notices to our customers, our utility customers, whom we have to notice about any proposed rate increases in advance of a hearing we have in early June. So under Prop 218, we have to send out notices, which we'll do. But we typically come, or every year we come to the Finance Committee to make sure that we're on track and we give you a sense of where we're going with rates and what the notices are going to sort of say, so you can give us direction if you to support that or not support that. We're going to do solid waste and wastewater. You may recall that for water, we last year adopted a 3-year resolution, so we don't need to do any noticing, or that we've got that in place for 3 years, this year, next year, and the year after. And we could talk about those if you'd like, but we're really going to focus today on wastewater and solid waste. Ms. Lisa Royal, she is going to be here to present the wastewater rates that are proposed for next year. She's the wastewater systems manager, and with that, I'll turn it over to her.
Ms. Araya, thank you for being here.
Thank you, and good afternoon. In today's presentation regarding wastewater rates, we'll be going over the goals and objectives of our financial plan, reviewing our financial plan, any proposed changes, and open it up for discussion and questions and answers. If at any point in time you want to ask a question in my presentation, I would be happy to answer it. I showed a slide very similar to this last year. It is our 10-year financial plan. You may recall that in 2014, Ralph Tellis completed a financial plan study which covered a 10-year time frame between fiscal years 2014 through 2023. What they concluded was that we had adequate revenues to fund operating costs, but they weren't sufficient to support the capital projects over the next 5 years. We had rate increases, and then we had Ralph Tellis come back again in 2015 to take a look at the financial plan again, because what we noticed was, even though we were having planned rate increases, the increase in revenues wasn't consistent with the rate increases because of a number of reasons, conservation being one of them. At that time, we were having a lot of conservation by our community, and it affected how much revenues we were getting back in, even with the rate increases. So as you look at this slide right here, you'll see for the fiscal years through 2019, our 10-year financial plan, which is the middle column, was what we adopted in 2014. And then the revenue adjustment, those were anything that we adjusted when we went back and revised it in 2015. A couple other things they looked at in their study was making sure that we have cost of service that is based on, we're charging rates appropriate with cost of service, and to make sure that we have revenue stability with the decrease in water usage. So while in 2015 and 2016 we stayed consistent with our 10-year plan, 2017 through 2019 we projected increases in our rates. When we look at our financial plan, we looked at some key assumptions. We had minimal growth as far as build out. We had typically a 3% inflation from year to year for our operating plan, and then we also used historical interest rates for our debt funding. As far as expenses go, we did take a look at operating and our capital needs, and also to make sure that we have sufficient reserves to meet policy. I think that's a great picture for you guys to look at. That is the El Estero Wastewater Treatment Plant. If you haven't been down there lately, we are under construction. We have been for several years, but that is a picture of our secondary process improvements project, which is currently under construction. And it goes to show the magnitude of work that we are doing at El Estero at this time. Showed a slide very similar to this last year. This has been updated because we went through a master plan work effort in the last year for El Estero. Our plant is aging, and we wanted to have a consultant come in and take a look at what needs we would be, what capital projects we'd need over the next 10 years, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, this slide shows our capital projects over the next 10 years or so. And the bottom line is the green is our pay-as-you-go capital, which is generally around $4 to $5 million that we pay. We use it for collection system projects, lift station, and some El Estero work. The blue is our debt funded or our state revolving fund projects, and that's really just our cash flow, what we expect to pay each year for the projects. As you'll see, we have a fairly large amount over the years 2017, 2018, and into 2019, and that's your secondary process improvements construction. And then in the next grouping of numbers from 21 through 23, that will be our next SRF funded project, which is anticipated to be major electrical improvements at the plant.
Councilmember Dominguez.
Thank you. What is pay-as-you-go or pay-go?
So we set aside a certain portion of our total budget for pay-as-you-go capital, which is it's usually $4 to $5 million. That's we collect somewhere around 21 million every year in revenues, pays for operating costs, debt service, and pay-as-you-go capital. So that's just our bread and butter collection system projects, our lift station projects, those that we can generally accomplish within about a year and a half time frame.
And what's the source of those funds?
From rates.
Okay. So that's just a percentage of the bill, or is it delineated differently on the bill? Or
It is not delineated different on the bill, but we do fairly regularly and consistently put $4 to $5 million in that capital account and have those on as routine maintenance type projects.
So if I can add to that, so the green is either funded from current revenues, rates, or reserves. So, depending on what kind of reserve status they might have, they may fund some of their capital program, their ongoing sort of base amount from reserves, but some portion of it is covered from existing revenues, ongoing revenues as well, versus the blue, which is all debt funded.
and you said something about $21 million. Is that a yearly total?
That ballpark is about 21 in
So where does
revenues.
the other 16 or 17 million go?
Some of it's going to go to debt funding, and some of it is going to go our debt payments on our bonds, our SRF funded projects. We have operating costs that fill a very large portion of that.
Is that the majority of that balance?
Correct.
So 12, 13 million. How much is the debt payment? Maybe that's an easier question to ask.
I cover that later in the
Okay.
presentation, if it'd be okay to wait
Sure.
for that question.
Thank you.
Sure. So this is talking about our capital projects. In our collection system, we typically do 1.5 to 2 million in pay-as-you-go capital projects in our collection system. We do a lot of focus on repair and rehabilitation. That's a picture right there where they're rehabilitating a sewer line. We do sometimes CCTV is paid for out of this fund, as well as chemical root treatment and asset management. For our lift stations, in the past, we have done a second force main at the La Colina lift station. That was completed in 2015. We're going to be going back and rehabilitating the first force main because it was in poor condition. We got our redundant one installed in 2015. We'll be putting in a new one, or we'll be rehabilitating the old in 2018. We'll also be spending a significant amount of money, on the average about $2.5 million, for the Braemar lift station rehabilitation in 2018. And then we'll be looking to spend a lot of money, about $2 to $3 million, for the Villa Lucero lift station rehabilitation. So those are some of the projects that we have on the horizon for the lift stations. Again, those are going to be pay-as-you-go capital projects. As far as El Estero, we have a couple of different items going on there. We have the equipment rehabilitation, and that is our smaller capital projects, the pay-as-you-go, where we'll be rehabilitating or replacing pumps or tanks, something of a smaller magnitude that's accomplished within 1 or 2 years worth of funding. We also have our strategic plan. A great example of what we would pay for out of our strategic plan is when we did our long-range facility or master plan effort this last year. We also, if we need to do any consultant asset management support, we take it out of the strategic plan account. And then we also have SRF funded projects. Right there is another picture of our secondary process improvements project. They are working on an aeration basin right there, reconstructing it. And then we'll also have an upcoming electrical upgrades project. I do want to take a quick moment and talk about our master plan because it's very important when we talk about rates. Brown and Caldwell came in and they took a look at our facility as a whole, ranked all of our process areas by likelihood of failure and consequence of failure. And as you look at that matrix, you'll see the green, the yellow, and the red. On the vertical axis, that's the likelihood of failure. Each piece of equipment was taken a look at how likely is it going to fail based on their condition, maintenance records, things like that. And then the criticality of failure is on the horizontal axis. What happens if that equipment fails? Do we have redundancy? Is it the most critical piece of equipment in the plant? And if we fail, are we going to not be able to treat wastewater? If you take the product of those two numbers, which are from 1 to 5 on both likelihood of failure and consequence of failure, you'll get a criticality rating. 25 is the highest, all the way down to 1 is the lowest. So they did that. They went through 25, projected out to 25 years. And really the punchline to this is we have about $70 million worth of projects we'll need to do at El Estero over the next 25 years. We've got a project timeline. We've got some of the larger projects you'll see there. We've got $16 million right there. That's probably going to be our first debt-funded project, is going to be electrical. We are going to kick that off in the near future. A couple of years later, we'll have another very large dewatering project, which will be about $16 million, again, debt funded. What we're trying to do is time the debt fund payment so that when one, and I'll show, you'll see it on the next slide, when one payment falls off, another one will kick in to try to keep the debt funding as consistent as possible to help with rates. And then a new digester will be way out on the horizon in about 25 years. So debt funding wise, we are currently, as you see, we have about $1.6 million in debt funding as we have today. We're going to be looking at about 2.1 when we start paying, additional 2.1 when we start paying for the secondary process improvements project, which will bring our debt funding up to about $3.7 million. The year 2025, we're going to start to see our next project, which is our electrical, come online, and we're going to be just shy of about $5 million in debt funding. And then in the outer years, when the bonds, we repay those and we don't have that debt payment anymore, we'll substitute it with our dewatering project. So this has been very helpful to go through this exercise with a consultant and try to match our needs with our funding as an effort to try to keep our rates down as low as possible, but be able to treat wastewater and continue to invest into the wastewater treatment plant as needed.
Yes, go ahead.
Just a question, because it's come up that when we're looking to enhance reclaimed water, possibly in the future, this doesn't take into account any upgrades that would require, correct? Because it's such a new technology. I just want to make sure if we do that, then these numbers would go up, but that's not factored in.
So when we start, are you talking, you're talking reuse?
Reuse, yeah.
Correct. So that's really a water supply. So that would more than likely be paid for from the water fund and out of the water budget. We are doing enhancements. For example, the secondary process improvement project will help us with treating wastewater to a better level that'll be easier for us to use for reuse. So there are things that we are doing keeping that in mind, but the actual funding of any reuse facility would likely come from water. It is not planned from wastewater. So this is another way to take a look at our debt service. We have currently our FOG and Headworks loans and our bond payment, and that is representative of the middle green right in here. The lower portion, this is actually our total budget. The lower blue is going to be our operational expenses, and then the red on the top is going to be our reserves. We're going to expect our secondary process improvements project debt fund to come in, payment to be right around 2020. That's a year. We're a year later than originally anticipated. It'll bring our debt funding up to about $3.7 million, and then our electrical project will bring it up to just shy of $5 million, estimated in 2025.
Councilmember Dominguez.
Could you go back to the last slide, please? So the reserves funding, the red, looks like it's over time it's going up by about 50%. Does that mean we're underfunded now?
No, sir. We're not underfunded. We are at policy. One of the things that happens when you do SRF funding is you have a year's worth of payment in reserve, and so we're going to need to continue to build our reserves because we'll need to have we'll have to have basically $5 million worth of payments in reserves over policy. So we have our policies, and I think that might be on our next slide. And then this is in addition to that. So you will see it grow.
So that's interesting. So the amount we have to have on reserve is as much as the debt itself. So why would we go into debt?
1 year's worth of payment on reserve. So we have a 30, take for example, the secondary process improvements project. It's a $33 million project. We have about a $1.8 million debt payment, I believe it is. So we need to have that $1.8 million in reserves, 1 year's worth of payment.
Oh, okay, I see. So this is a different type of reserve. So this red slide is both the general reserve requirement and adding in the reserve required by the financing institution.
Correct. As part of the SRF loan, they want you to have a year's worth of debt payments in reserves.
Okay. And can you explain what SRF?
SRF is a state revolving fund loan or installment payment agreement program. So we are able to borrow money over a 20-year period, usually is what it is, at a pretty low interest rate. I think we're at about a 1.9%.
Okay. So it's a financing source. It's actually not a revenue source. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Can I just, so I had to think about this slide when you asked the question because it's the first time I'd seen this. So unlike traditional financing or bonds, for example, when there is a reserve requirement, and there is typically a reserve requirement equal to what is called the maximum annual debt service payment, so you have to set aside money. But normally when you sell bonds, it comes out of the bond proceeds, so you size up the bonds in order to fund that proceeds, that reserve. With SRF loans, they don't do that. It's sort of a reimbursement loan, so we don't get any money sort of to cover reserve requirements. So they say to us, you have time to build up that reserve, but we want you to get to within like 10 years or less the equivalent of an annual debt service reserve. So it's kind of, you think of our regular reserves, they have this extra requirement to reserves just because that's the normal, we typically do.
And it's kind of a percentage of your revenue.
It's just it's equal to an annual debt service payment. That's what they require. We are right now what we're doing, because we have some of the reserve requirements for the bonds, we are basically counting our contingency reserves toward that. But over time, we want to build up a new reserve corresponding to what our annual debt service payments are, in addition to our regular policy reserves. But that's what the idea is, to build that up over time.
So,
does that make sense?
Yeah, and it looks like in fiscal year 18, somewhere around $3 to $4 million.
Yes.
And then in 25, the last year up there, it looks like it's some $7.5–8 million.
Yeah, that's, I think that's the pink is, or the red is the reserve that they're asking us. That's 4.9 million is what we're supposed to be carrying as an additional reserve in addition to our regular reserves.
Okay.
So it's just a requirement because we're not funding it out of any kind of bond proceeds. We've got to build it up from our existing resources over time.
Great. Thank you.
And maybe just to ask an additional question about that, most agencies around the state don't have the conservative reserve policy that we have, and so the state would substitute that requirement as a way to ensure the fiscal stability of an entity that it's loaning money to. Are we being aggressively conservative by having double reserves in that instance?
Yeah, committee member Hart, I don't think so, because let's think the water fund, they will sell bonds periodically. If they have a reserve requirement, they have to fund it out of bond proceeds, so it's still required, and it's set aside in a trust, and it's for the bondholders' benefit, separate from our own reserves, so they don't look at our own reserves to determine whether that reserve is required, because it's for different purposes. So I don't think they're being aggressive by setting aside a separate reserve, because it's for that particular purpose. If something happens that we can't make the payments, the state says we want it come from a pot of money that's dedicated to us. Your reserve is for your purposes, not for our purposes. So I don't think it's to a great extent redundant. I think it's appropriate to have a separate reserve, since we would do that for if we sold bonds, for example.
Okay. Councilmember Dominguez.
Just building off that, so could we lower our policy reserve by either the full amount or half of the debt service reserve amount? If we wanted to be less aggressive, I'm not suggesting we should
Yeah.
do that, but would we be able to if we wanted?
We could, and when we sort of do that already. So when we calculate our reserve requirements, we don't include two things. We don't calculate the capital expenditures, and we don't calculate debt service payments. So we don't set, our reserve requirements are 25%, right? So this would suggest that we would pick up $1.2 million of additional policy reserves to cover the debt service, but we don't do that. We back that out. So what we're covering in our reserve at 25% is just truly operating costs, excluding capital, excluding debt service payments.
That's an important clarification. Thank you. Mrs. Arroyo, you want to continue?
Thank you. So here's our reserves. 25% of our operating budget, 15% is disaster recovery, 10% is contingency. In addition, we have capital. We also have a $1 million rate stabilization, which was developed as part of our bond refinancing, and then our SRF payments. One thing you'll notice is in this year right here, we're a little bit high. We were expecting to start our payments for our secondary aeration project. In that year, it's going to be delayed. It's going to be pushed back 1 year, so we would expect to pay them a year later. But as you can see, we're going to want to continue to grow them so that we can ultimately get to that $5 million in debt funding that we're anticipating in 2025. So similar to last year, talking about sewer service charges, about 90% of our revenues come from sewer service charges. Right there you can see our greatest charges are coming from residential. We have a 46% roughly is residential fixed. That is that fixed component of their bill. And then the 39% is volumetric. That's the green portion. But overall, we're about 85% comes from our residential sewer service charges. As far as operational costs, we are fairly fixed. We're at about 87% fixed, with a smaller portion being residential at 13. We've talked about it at the last couple of Finance Committee hearings when we came for rates, is that we have more variability in our rates and revenues and less variability in our costs, our fixed. So one of the things we are going to be doing is hiring a rate consultant, probably going out for a request for proposal process within the next couple of months. Hire a rate consultant. We'll be taking a look at several things, this being one of them, making sure that we have rates that will support operations and that might be a little bit more in line with more fixed rates and more in line with more fixed costs. We'll also be matching our overall capital project that we just went through, the facility plan, that 25-year plan, and making sure that we have sufficient rate structure to support that $70 million. We believe we do, but we're going to hire a rate consultant to confirm it. And then we'll also be taking a look at doing a 3-year plan or 3 to 5 year multi-year plan versus year to year, similar to what water's done.
Councilmember Dominguez?
Just to clarify, so if I understood you correctly, the consultant's going to look at increasing fixed rates as opposed to volumetric rates?
Not necessarily increasing the overall bill, but looking at how we can have more of a fixed component and less variability. So it would help. It would help in times of drought and things like that, where we wouldn't have a severe drop in revenues when most of our costs are fixed. So it would help stable out the bill, so to speak.
So I'm fundamentally opposed to that. I think the percentages we have now, where it's more fixed than volumetric in terms of a percentage, is much higher than I'd like to see. And I appreciate the concerns for the stabilization, and we can talk about maybe a rate stabilization fund to take care of that. But I think what it does is it punishes the residents in town who are least able to deal with these fluctuations in their household level. They can conserve all they want, but because of that big fixed costs, they're not getting the same return on their conservation as bigger users. So to me, there's a social justice component that's really of concern. So that's why I just wanted to ask to make sure I understood that. But I would be opposed to that direction.
Just to clarify, go back to that slide. I think the slide that showed 87%, the one that before that, I guess.
Next
After that, yeah, after
That one?
So this is not the revenue side. This is the expense side. Right. So 80s, but on the revenue side, what percentage of our revenues are fixed? So 40.
We have about 46
Okay.
coming in that are fixed, and that is one thing that was always a concern when we had Raftellus come in and take a look at that. Was how do we make sure that we're not punishing the lower end users, and that's definitely going to be something that we'll take a look at. We will be looking at all classes, so we want to make sure that we have the industrial users paying their share and make sure that the commercial users are their share. And I'm hopeful that we can come up with a good strategy that's not going to do what you are concerned about, because it is a concern of it was 2 years ago, and it remains a concern. So we'll definitely keep that in mind. Here is what our overall increase to a monthly bill will likely look like for our lower water users. We're going to be expecting a $2.25 or $2.25 more. For our higher end users, someone over 10 HCF per month, they will see about a $3 increase. It's $3.01. This is what it, and I believe you have a flyer, or did you get a copy in your packet of our rate notice? This is for wastewater, what will go out in the mail, showing everybody what they can expect to see as far as increases based on their user classification. And here's how we compare to our neighboring sanitation agencies. Most of them are charged on their tax bill, so that you would get a bill twice a year. What I did is I just converted it to what it would be as a monthly payment. Galena Sanitation is definitely still the low at $41.38. Our current rates are the darker blue line at $50.52. Carpinteria Sanitation is the green at $52.11, and then our proposed rate increase is going to be $53.73, and then we have Montecito on the right at $115. So at this point, we are recommending that we stick to our revised plan of an increase of 6%. It's to help with our CIP funding, our capital improvement program funding, and able to keep our reserves strong. When I presented to Water Commission in February, that was one thing that they were very interested in and very vocal about, is they wanted us to maintain a strong reserve account. Again, we're going to be going out for a rate consultant, and as far as fee goes, we're going to be in line with about a 3% increase to fees. If there are any changes to that, we'll be back to the Finance Committee before we go out for adoption. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Ms. Arroyo. Appreciate the presentation. Are there any other questions for staff? Are there any questions from members of the public on the wastewater rates? Not on the wastewater rates? Okay. And this is you don't actually look for action. You're just giving us a preview for the...
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, we can still have solid waste, but certainly if you would like us to do something different, with regard to the noticing that's going to be coming up in a month or two, we'd love to hear from you about that. Otherwise, we're going to move forward based on these recommended rates.
Okay. Councilmember Dominguez?
So my concerns are, and let me just start by saying I think I want to thank staff because I know it's been a tough environment to reach your goals, but my concerns are for mostly economic, but environmental concerns as well for my constituents. I'd love to see us look at those reserve policies and see if we can shrink one as the other one grows. Again, just to provide some relief to water rates in the short term. I'm concerned about our ability to manage these infrastructure costs. They've been higher than I've liked to have seen in the past, and I want to make sure we're doing all we can to contain them. I'm not sure what we did after a few recent projects came in higher than budget in terms of an after-event management study and what we can do in the future to prevent similar incidences, whether we use a different design bid structure, whatever the department thinks would work, but I'd like to see some proposals. I'm concerned about the fixed portion of the revenue from customers and the fact that it doesn't incentivize to the highest level environmentally friendly behavior and economically friendly behavior. And then overall, I'm concerned about the high numbers that we're paying more than our neighbors in Goleta and Carp, and we have a much higher economy of scale. So those are all the concerns I have. So I just want to register those. But again, I know it's a tough environment, and you guys are working really hard. So I appreciate that.
Mr. Hagmark?
Councilmember Hart, Councilmember Dominguez. One of the things, Ms. Arroyo, if you could go back to the slide comparison to the other districts.
Yes.
One of the things that I want to point out in this is something that hit me recently with this is that $50 that we have, now that's for a 10 HCF user. We certainly have customers paying less than that. If you are using less than 10 HCF of water, 1,000 cubic feet per month, what Goleta Sanitary does, every residential customer pays $41. So they have fixed it all. So that means they don't have people paying, in some cases, $30 a month or less for sewer service. Everyone's paying that amount. And so what it's done is they fixed that revenue so they don't have that. So it's kind of an unfair comparison in that sense. I mean, we're not really comparing apples to apples with some of these comparisons. And so I think if you were to pull apart, we're probably more on par with Goleta than it looks.
Do you know what the fixed fee is? I'm a renter, so I never see this bill. It just gets passed on to me in my rent. I don't know if you fellows know.
I don't know.
In the sewer bill?
Yep.
The city sewer bill? We can go back to here. Can we?
Not off the top of my head.
Because you mentioned 30. I wasn't sure if you were addressing that specifically.
I want to say the fix was like 17. Maybe I'm confusing.
In other
with
words,
water.
if someone never uses any water, they literally are,
Right. If they're a 1 HCF customer, like they're living alone and they don't have any other external outdoor water usage, I want to say it was like $24, $25, and then you start paying the variable after that. So there's a really low amount that you'd pay.
Okay.
I can get that exact number for you.
And I don't know if we're this city has about 60 to 65% renters. So I don't know how many people are in my position where they never see these bills. So I'm not sure how sensitive they are to the fixed versus volumetric billing anyways, but it's certainly something that I'd like to see us take a hard look at in terms of how we can really get people to move forward. I think right now the population is really ready to dig in and be more environmental. This is the city that founded Earth Day, so I'd love to see people who want to really be able to use their behavior to save the local environment and cut back on the rates. So that's the only reason I bring it up. I know I've tended to be in the minority when we talk about it with the water rates as well. But again, I just would like for us to take a harder look. And even if it turns out it wouldn't make an impact, it would be good to have that answer. So that's why I keep throwing it out there.
I think we're on the same page, and I think going through this next study will be really helpful and diving into that. Thank you.
When do you anticipate that rate study would be completed?
My hope and goal would be for next year. Getting a consultant on board now or as soon as possible so that when we're here next year, hopefully we're looking at a 3-year or a multi-year versus a single year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other additional questions for staff? Let's move on to the rate increases for solid waste.
Right. And
Thank you, Ms. Arroyo.
Thank you.
in this portion, it will be presented by Renee Irely. Ms. Marlene, she is our Environmental Services Manager. And we are using new technology, which is kind of cool. I don't know if you saw the being able to write on the screen, kind of
Did not notice that.
like John Madden does on NFL football, you know.
Okay.
It's kind of a cool little tip.
Yes, it's great when it works. Sorry.
Exactly.
Perfect. We're all going to get to see my children. There you go.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Right, Ms. Irely, thank you for being here to make this presentation. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to go through our solid waste rates proposals for this fiscal year. This year, as is fairly typical, there are usually a couple of drivers that go into the necessary rate increases. This year, they're being driven by 3 different elements. One is the annual CPI increase to the Marburg contract for collection services. The second is the increase in county tipping fees, which is also being guided by the waste services agreement that we have with the county. And then the third is some program adjustments just to make our current operations whole. So in regards to the collection service, as you know, we have a franchise agreement with Marburg. It's a 10-year agreement. We're about halfway through that agreement currently. And annually, we adjust that compensation by CPI, actually 70% of the CPI, and that's written into the agreement. And we pay them monthly based on that adjustment. The second element is our tipping fees to the county, and we receive generally notification of that this time of year, and we build that into our rates. Last December, as we entered into the waste services agreement with the county for the Tahiguis Resource Recovery Project, that set in motion a step up of tipping fees in anticipation of the project moving forward. So in fiscal year for 2018, per that agreement, there was a project delay, but per the agreement, the county had raised the tipping fee to $99 a ton. As you recall, initially council had directed us to not move forward with that incorporating into the rate. So last year, the rate adjustment was essentially for the CPI for Marburg. We did not add in the $99 per ton. We are adding that in this year for going forward. And that tonnage we were then subsequently directed to begin that payment, and that's been coming out of our reserves for this year. Per the agreement as well, for this coming fiscal year for 2019, the tipping fee was set at $110 per ton. The county last week, given that there has been a second project delay, adjusted that tipping fee down to $102 per ton. for the fiscal year rather than moving forward with the entire $110 a ton. As we potentially move forward with the project, we will be coming back to council with what the estimated tipping fees will be for next fiscal year for 2020 and going forward. Right now, we don't have a firm number for that. We have seen some preliminary numbers where that might be in the 140-ish per ton range, but we'll know more about that in the coming months. And again, just as a reminder, the purpose of moving through a multi-year tip fee increase was twofold. One was to create a rate stabilization fund so that in future years there was more predictability in the rate increases. And then the second is obviously to demonstrate to potential bond holders that there's sufficient revenue for the project. Then, as I said, the third small element, less than 1%, is making some program budget rebalancing, and this is partly driven to some of our internal costs around our program operations, and then also making some adjustments, still somewhat to be determined with the county around recycling cost impacts. In this next slide, it is showing the breakdown for our proposed revenue requirements and rate increase. I apologize, there is a line missing from this, which is for actually the Marburg CPI adjustment, which is about $598,000, and it's at the 2.6% of the overall 12.1 increase. A minor adjustment for our enhanced abandoned waste program, the program adjustments, as I mentioned before, and then the lion's share is from the tip fee increase. So to get us to the $99 per ton for both garbage and recyclable tonnages, that is about an 8% increase to the rates. And then to make the fiscal year 2019 adjustment to get us to $102 per ton, it's about a 9.9% increase.
Councilmember
Yes,
Friedman?
I just want to clarify. So the basically the 8% of this proposed 12% increase is we're no longer using reserves, and it's to get us up to where we would have been if we had done that last year.
That's correct.
Correct. And
Yes.
then the other small percentage is from the 99 to the 102. So the majority of this is from going to the 99.
Yes,
That's currently being funded through reserves.
that's correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Dominguez?
And then where will our reserves be at this point? Will they be below policy limits?
We will still be within policy. Fortunately, we had adequate resources in the reserves to be able to cover that. It all told for the fiscal year, it will be close to $1.6 million that we'll be paying from the reserves. So.
And so we were about $1.5 million over reserve?
Yes, we had a little over $3 million in the reserves. Yes.
3 million's over reserve or 3 million total? And
$3 million total in the reserve. And so we're anticipating end of year to have a reserve of about $1.5 million.
And is it the same as wastewater, where it's about 25% is our policy?
Yes,
requirement?
that's correct. And we cover primarily our internal operations because the bulk of the revenue is passed through to Marburg.
The overall budget is somewhere around $23 million. We don't reserve 25% of that because 85 or 90% of that, it goes to Marburg just to pass through. So we reserve the portion that's related to our program activities, which is about $2.5 million. So we reserve 25% of that. So our reserve is somewhere in the $750,000 range. So we have $1.5 million now at the end of this year. We project. So we'd be over reserve policies by about double.
So, and is this pretty common for cities in terms of having their policy reserve limit set on their administrative costs, not the company? Because I'm just wondering what happens if Marburg, for whatever reason, isn't able to provide the service. We'd only have probably, well, we have now $1.5 million, but we could possibly only have 700,000
Right.
in the bank to deal with that crisis.
Yeah, if they can't provide their service, then they'd be a breach of contract, and we wouldn't compensate them, so we just wouldn't pay them. I'm not too concerned about that. They're a long-standing company. I think the reserve of $750, the reserve requirement that relates to our own operating costs, our own programs is appropriate. I'm not sure we would want to reserve an amount that really relates to their contract and their services. I just think it would be unnecessary.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Friedman?
Just a follow-up question. So if we chose to reduce the proposal of 12%, then that would be funded from, some of that would continue to fund from reserves then, correct?
That's correct, Councilmember. Yeah.
Go ahead and continue, Ms. Arley.
Thank you. So as a summary, we brought forward a few of our representative customer levels to see the impact on their rates. One of our most common single-family resident service is 65-gallon trash with the similar green waste and recycling. Their current rate is $36.98 per month. That proposed rate would increase to $41.42 per month. Multi-unit residential, again, for 5 95-gallon trash, green waste and recycling, that's picked up one time a week. They would be moving, again, at 12% across the board from $247.89 a month to $277.71. And then we've also supplied a couple of our more common business service levels, one for carts and can service, and then also our common dumpster service, which is 4 yards of trash and recycling 2 times a week. In comparison to some of the other service providers, both locally and around California, if you look at the chart, the first two listed are our current rates for single family, which is the $36 per month, and then our proposed rate in the $41.42. The next 6 listed there are our neighbors, either right within the county or right in Ventura. So Carpinteria and Ventura are both serviced by E.J. Harrison, and they run about 20% below us. Goleta, the county, both in Montecito and Summerlin, and then in Mission Canyon, run anywhere from about 7% more to 33% less. And that's really, in some ways, dependent on what the service area looks like and the difficulty in operation and for them to be serviced. And also with the caveat that we do offer I think really good, like, standardized services. I was going to talk about something else. So, and that also, I guess my other point is that these are all serviced by the same facilities. So Marburg is their collector, they use the county transfer station, Tehicos landfill, and then they're also using Gold Coast as the recycling processor down in Ventura. And just as of interest in looking at comparatively to some other similarly sized cities up in the Bay Area, such as Berkeley, Palo Alto, and Santa Cruz, who are also offering residential compost and may be using, for example, Santa Cruz, where they're using regular composting operations. Berkeley and Palo Alto both have some sort of enhanced composting and energy generation, like anaerobic digestion, just to give a sense of what some of their per customer costs look like for services.
It occurs to me that San Luis Obispo seems to be an outlier. In
They
that
are
equation.
they are a bit of an outlier. You're quite right, and they are also in transition. So they have started offering residential compost, but they are in the process of building an anaerobic digester, and that should be online in probably within the next year. So it is similar. Yes, that's.
And so their rates aren't reflective of those additional
they're not.
costs
Yes,
yet.
that's correct.
Okay.
Yes, so.
Thank you. Councilmember Dominguez?
And when you talk about these residential composting program, what exactly are they doing? Just out of curiosity.
Of course. Thank you, Councilmember. For example, for Santa Cruz, the residential food waste is also collected with green waste, and it is being open windrowed in terms of its processing. So it's ground, it's laid out on the ground in long windrows, and it's turned, and it's a very traditional type of composting processing. For Berkeley, they are using, I believe it's actually a combination of types of processing. One being part of their waste stream actually goes to, well, this will be their commercial system, so it's not quite what I've put on the board, but they have a commercial collection system that actually goes to their wastewater treatment facility, and it's incorporated into their digesters. And then on the residential side, their provider has both a traditional composting program, as I described, for Santa Cruz, and then there's also anaerobic digestion. So depending on the customer, it can go to a couple different locations. The same for
Do they separate it at the household, or do they have a separator that the facility runs?
There is right now it is all source separated at the residence, but they do have plans to also do the back end, sort of the dirty MRF processing as well. So,
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
okay. And I believe Mr. Samario has already gone through sort of like our adoption timeline, but there it is for you. Again, we'll be looking to notice and then bring these formally for hearing on June 12th.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Are there any additional questions of staff? Mr. Shatillo, would you like to comment? Just make sure the green light's on.
There we go. Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Mark Shatillo. I'm here on behalf of the Gaviota Coast Conservancy, and thank you for convening the hearing and giving me time to make it from the other committee room where I thought you would be at City Hall with the wastewater issue. So perfect timing. Thank you. So Gaviota Coast Conservancy, as you know, is very concerned about preserving the integrity of the Gaviota Coast and avoiding the industrialization. And that includes both oil facilities as well as our Tahiguas landfill. We recognize it as a fact of life on the coast. However, we would like to see it closed down and facility and activities, active operations reduced as much as possible. That's our agenda. But we recognize that we all generate solid waste and we all have a responsibility to responsibly manage it. The city, as the largest generator of solid waste that goes to Tahiguas, a single entity jurisdiction, has a larger role, and so we wanted to share our concerns with you and ask that you continue to exercise your due diligence. Remember that while we are in this period of delay, bonds have not issued, and so under the contract, it's a very different circumstance that the city finds itself in now, all of the jurisdictions, as where you will be when bonds issue. That contract makes it clear that once the bond's issued, everybody is locked in. So this is a time when you do have more opportunities to look at what are the options, what is going to be in the best interests of the city of Santa Barbara, its ratepayers, as well as we would hope the Gaviota Coast. The TERP, the project that you're proposing, you're being asked to consider raising rates in order to accommodate, a big chunk of that is for the recovery project out at Tehiguis, was designed some 8-10 years ago, and circumstances have changed quite a bit. And I think it's appropriate that the city be mindful of that and consider keeping its eyes open and its options open with respect to its management of solid waste. We have a different characterization of waste. The waste stream has changed pretty dramatically. We've seen that the costs have increased substantially. There have been delays. There's now been a redesign of the project and an escalation of costs. You've also seen on the revenue side, with China's green sword policy now, the recycled market is not what it used to be. And there are some exciting new technologies that are being developed for carbon sequestration using compost. And one of the principal objections that we have with respect to the technology of the recovery project is its reliance on the anaerobic digester and the effect that that has on foreclosing the production of high-quality clean compost produced in an aerobic process as opposed to an anaerobic process. That aerobically produced compost is an essential ingredient for carbon sequestration through carbon farming, where we're able to actually take atmospheric carbon through the use of compost and other agricultural techniques to stimulate the soil biota and actually draw atmospheric carbon into the soil and sequester it within the soil profile. It's not the carbon in the compost, it's the biological activity in the compost that stimulates this carbon sequestration benefit. Just last Friday, we were able to witness the kickoff of a 400-acre demonstration project here in Santa Barbara County at the Chamberlain Ranch, where compost will be used to practice carbon farming on a test basis to be able to confirm the small plots that have been used at that facility are now being expanded from 1 acre plots into these hundreds of acre plots using locally generated compost. The expectation is that there'll be more carbon farming projects coming forward locally, and there's an estimate that there will be a need for 400,000 tons of compost per year. So compost is going to be the limiting factor, and so that's one of the main reasons why we'd ask that the city do take care in terms of its planning and its program here. The other significant change is new state laws that require the diversion of organic waste and provide an opportunity for the source separation of organic waste so that it can be kept clean and directed into a compost production approach as opposed to the anaerobic digester. It's critical that the feedstock be as clean as possible so that the compost is high enough quality that the landowners will want to put it on their land. And what we've seen elsewhere in other parts of the state is that the anaerobic digestion-based compost does not always meet, and it's not meeting the acceptability in terms of the landowner's desire, and there are some important chemical and biological distinctions between these two forms of compost. So what I'd like to ask that the council consider doing is to keep your option open. Like staff's recommendation for the wastewater treatment plan rate program, consider hiring a solid waste management consultant to help analyze what the current project is and what your options are. There are increasing risks along with the increasing costs associated with the Tehiguis project. And there are other solutions that may be available to the city, accompanied with the enhanced source separation opportunities, organic waste source separation that are going to come as a requirement of complying with state law. As you look at the retrofitting and the upgrading of the city's wastewater treatment plant, it employs an anaerobic digester. And one of the things that in this compost versus digestate question, you want to keep the clean organic material going to the compost stream, but when you commingle the organic waste, such as with the dirty MRF, you then don't have a clean byproduct out of that, and it may well be that that is more appropriately sent to the anaerobic digester. As you look at your options for the city in designing its revised wastewater treatment plant digesters, there are other communities that have found that they can take their organic solid waste, macerate it, and then put it into their wastewater treatment plant in order to extract the methane from there, use that for energy goals, and then you have the biosolids, which similarly can be treated, but they don't have the high level of benefit that organic compost does. So that's an example of an option that I think that the city may want to keep an eye on as you look now at what these rates are, what your options are, and whether there may be another path that would be able to assist meeting the city's goals and providing leadership in the county as we look at dealing with solid waste issues. And then lastly, I think it's critically important that you keep an eye on the financials. The city was asked and the other jurisdictions were asked through the initial contract to dedicate funds to a rate stabilization fund that was supposed to be able to help smooth some of the economic disruptions that could happen. And that's exactly what's happening now with the with the changes in the Chinese recycling market. The county had to revise its contract with Gold Coast. Instead of paying $100,000 a year, they increased that contract to $600,000 a year in order to help buffer the costs of managing the recyclables. Now, that's kind of a separate stream from what's happening with the rate stabilization fund. But the city, we should know as city ratepayers that the rate stabilization fund is available if we are going to continue with the Teaguas project to help mitigate those funds. And I'm not certain that those funds that the county has actually isolated and kept the rate stabilization funds for that purpose. My understanding is that some of those funds may be being used for other capital projects at the county in their solid waste program, and that's not what those funds were originally intended for. I also think that as you look at the financials, this prospect of a really big hit coming in the future, the reference to potentially $143 ton tipping fee next year represents a 40% increase in what is what looks like the largest element of the rate increase that you're seeing this year. That is the catch up from the $99 a ton from last year to 102. 87 to 99 to 102 is representing the largest increase, well above what the Marburg increase is. If that tip fee then increases to in the $140 range next year, that's going to be a very substantial impact on city rates and rates across the board. And I think it's important that the city go in with eyes wide open, that ratepayers understand that this is the consequence of the decisions around this project. And again, looking back at, well, are there alternatives that can avoid some of those increased expenses and maybe even yield better environmental benefits? That those are the kinds of things that we would strongly encourage that the city look at as they move forward with this. And then the last point I'd like to make is just a challenge that we've had in working with the county, and I wouldn't be surprised if this has also been a city issue, in the lack of transparency with respect to many aspects of this project, not only the financial parts, but also the technical and practical parts. Just this morning, the Board of Supervisors was considering adopting an urgency ordinance to allow the disposition, the temporary stockpiling of up to 2.5 million cubic yards of emergency debris at Teaguas landfill. There was very little information that's provided in the staff report. We were only by employing the offices of the fourth floor were we able to get staff to really answer the questions, the concerns that we had with respect to the use of Teaguas landfill. At the end, GCC supported that, and the board did approve that ordinance 5-0 this morning. But it was a very difficult process to get that information out. And I think it's really important, since we're dealing with such large amounts of money and we're dealing with such significant environmental impact and such an important resource to our community out on the Gaviota Coast, that there be a bright light and that all this information be readily available for the public, and we'd ask your offices to support us and the public in making sure that as we move ahead with these hard decisions around solid waste planning, that everybody knows what's really on the table and what we're talking about. So thank you for the additional time and allowing me to present my concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Siddall. Are there any other comments from members of the committee? Councilmember Dominguez?
So the if I understand correctly, you're saying we don't know what the rates will look like in fiscal year 2020 because the county hasn't told us what the rate increase would be for the tonnage fee?
That's correct. And before this most recent delay, we were expecting that the resource recovery project would be completed and operational sometime in fiscal year 20, probably late fiscal year 20. This recent delay may push that back even further. So what we don't know is, one, when is it going to become operational? It's looking more like fiscal year 2021. And what we also don't know is what the ultimate cost is going to be. Between now and December, I think that's what we hope to be part of the conversation with the county and determining what's going to be the impact of this delay, what's going to be the impact on financing of the delay, meaning interest rates, the terms. There's a lot of moving parts to this. We will be coming back to you on April 17th, giving you kind of an update on the project based on what we've learned recently in meeting with the county. But the big unknown is what's going to be the ultimate price. I think 143 was the latest kind of estimate before the recent delay. If I had to put a guess, it's going to be higher than that. But we just don't know what that is, and we won't know that until probably the fall.
Are we not involved in these meetings on a regular basis?
Well, they haven't started yet. We expect to be part of those conversations, but those will occur probably starting in August, when the financing discussions will begin again. I think they're dealing with the litigation challenge right now over the next several months, and then once that's behind, assuming it's a successful process, then they'll start up again in August or September with the financing and updating the model to see what the cost is going to be and ahead of the financing or the sale of the bonds.
So when you say the meetings haven't started yet, what meetings are you referring to?
It's really, updating the model. So I think the goal is to get past, the next several months, and then starting in August to reassemble the teams. And we expect that we be part of those discussions to look at the models, look at the numbers, how they've changed, and to calculate what the more updated revised estimate of the final tipping fee when it becomes operational. What happens in the middle of that, it's sort of hard to say because the contract expected, a three steps, going to 99, 110, and then whatever the final price was going to be. So since of the delay, we're kind of in a little bit of a limbo as to what happens between now and what happens in 2020. Again, I don't expect it to be operational then. So the question is going to be what is the county going to want to do for that sort of middle year, if you will.
And did these meetings take place earlier, and were we involved? Or do they just give us updates after their meeting?
Yeah. No, I mean, so this in 2016, December is when we brought to council the final agreement, and that was based on many years and some really, a lot of discussions. And then the bonds were supposed to be sold in March of 17, and then of course that was delayed. And between December of that 16 and March of 2017, what we weren't part of is the financing team that is put together with bond counsel, financial advisors to come up with what's the bond going to look like. And as a result of the structure, that the price did go up to something like 135, 137. We weren't part of those conversations. We learned about that in March or a little bit after that. But since then, we've spent time talking with them to get an understanding of what that 137 was. And then, of course, we had the more recent delay because of the litigation. So, again, we expect to be with them starting this fall or summer to get into the numbers and make sure we understand the numbers and what the final cost is going to be and why and so forth.
So my concern is that we're not privy to this information. We're not privy to management decisions as they're happening in real time. When the initial negligent action was discovered by the county, I think it took them about a month to let us know. So my concern is they have a different set of goals and outcomes that's not 100% aligned with the city, and that just makes sense. Any government institution is loyal to their constituents. And if we're not there and we're a 40% partner, we're basically liable for any mistakes they make or any bad decisions they make. So it's just startled me on several occasions when they bought land, when they were moving things around without telling us ahead of time. That's been of concern. So I think we need a place at the table in terms of what they're planning to do so we can be at least involved in providing our feedback. Ultimately, if they insist on making all the decisions themselves, that may be their choice legally. That's something that we need to know more about. So that would be my concern is that, and I'm concerned that we're not constantly updating the model. I'm not sure what the last model said and how still accurate it might be, because to me the model depends partly on when the project would be up and running and how long the project will last. There's a certain end date that we had modeled, and that moves up depending on whether we're diverting trash or not. So I'd like to see something that kind of continually updates that model, or even just says if we start in the middle of 2021, this is what the model looks like. If it starts the middle of 2022, this is what the model looks like. Again, some ballpark numbers that we can work with. I think we need to consider having a community meeting or a town hall meeting. The fact that we pay these out of reserves means that residents were insulated from these actions and these consequences. And now that we're going to charge them, they're going to be more aware. But again, with 60% of our city being renters, if their trash bills aren't directly passed on, they don't necessarily know why their rent might be going up. So having more accurate information provided to their constituents lets them be involved in the decision making. And ultimately, it's up to our constituents what we do and how we do it. And it's up to them if they want to take action and get involved in a different plan that requires more work on their end, but then might lead to a better economic and environmental impact for them. So that's kind of what I'm thinking now. How much at this point do we think the rates would go up if we had to take a guess in 2020?
Again, that's sort of like an interim year before it's operational in my estimation, so we don't know. I mean, don't know what the county will be thinking about a year from now.
Is there a best case, worst case scenario that we can talk about?
I mean, from my perspective and our perspective, I think what we're looking for is a nominal increase, if any increase in 2020, if it's not operational then, because again, the reason for increasing the rates ahead of the project becoming operational was for bondholder, confidence, but also to build up the reserve. But it was a one-time reserve; it wasn't an ongoing reserve. We don't need $1.6 million every single year from our contributions. It was a one-time funding that would come from the $99 a ton. So the continuation of that, or even an increase of that prior to operation, it would be just accumulating additional money that would have to be returned to us anyway. So again, I would be advocating for keeping the tipping fees constant in 2020, but that's a conversation a year from now.
Great, thank you.
And back to what was on our agenda today, which is the recommendation regarding solid waste fees and the noticing that'd be going out. Is there any difference of opinion than what staff has proposed for the 12% increase? Does anyone want to comment on that? Councilmember Dominguez?
I would say that we stick to the CPI. That would be my comment. And that's 2.6%. Is that correct?
And so you would propose that the difference be taken out of reserves?
I would propose that we don't pay the increased tipping fee, that the county hasn't done its due diligence in terms of modeling this, in terms of whether this is actually a project that's going to work. The county has never done an adequate job, even in the EIR, of analyzing alternatives. So I'd want them to communicate what their feelings are on that, and on whether they're going to hold us harmless for the mistake they made. They basically misread a map, and now our ratepayers are going to pay the cost for that. They've never addressed whether they're going to make us whole for that. So these are things that I'd want to hear before I saddle our ratepayers with that debt.
Okay, Councilmember Friedman.
I have a question. So if we go ahead and we fund it now, the 12%, and then it turns out later that maybe there is an alternative project down the line, these rates would come back. We could request these rates back, correct? Because we're paying for a project that never got built, correct?
Yes, I would expect that we would get the money back in some form. There might be other sort of costs that are either have been incurred or will need to be incurred without a TRRP. So I wouldn't expect the DSC want a dollar for dollar reimbursement, but I would say largely we would expect that the money would come back to us and we would be able to use that to restore reserves and offset future rate increases.
And some of this additional 8% is not just for the recovery project, but it's for the other costs that you mentioned. Now, say the project ends up going forward and we haven't increased it now, we'd have to do a bigger increase later, correct? Which, if the project does go forward.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, depending on where we end up with the tipping fee, if we don't do a rate increase this year, then and the project moves forward, it's in the $150 per range, we're going to be looking at a substantial increase. So, yeah, we know if I was certain it was going to happen and we're certain it's going to be at 150, I would say, sure, let's get there incrementally versus all at once.
Well, being that part of this increase is just the normal cost of doing business, some of it is for the recovery project, I would see if Councilmember Dominguez would support the staff recommendation today. We come back in a year and we get the data that you raise a lot of important issues. We get some of that data, and when it comes back next year, when we have the discussion on if it's going to be a larger increase up to the 140 or whatever that increase is. So this way, if turns out we don't go forward with that project, we can look at to get some of that recovery back. But if we do go forward with it, we haven't lessened our reserves and we don't have to go forward with a bigger increase, because I think anytime you keep funding from reserves and eventually you have to pay, that's a bigger impact on families, because if you know you have to budget for a certain thing every year, you're going to budget for it. But if all of a sudden you don't and then you get a 50, 60, 70% increase, that can be a budget buster. So would you be willing for this year to go with the staff recommendation and we have a fuller discussion when this comes up next year?
Councilmember Dominguez.
So I like that in principle. I think 12% is a bit of a budget buster. If you thought maybe somewhere in the middle, that might be something worth talking about. My concern is Mr. Samario's is he's right to the extent we can request the money back from the county, but there's zero guarantees. The worst case scenario is they say no, and then you could end up potentially in a legal situation, which means it's bad for both the county and us. Lawyers get paid, and the court could end up splitting the baby, or we can go to mediation. There's a lot of things that could happen. What the speaker said was once the bonds are issued, everything is locked in. I think if we stick to our guns, there's a chance that people will be more willing to look at ending this project rather than getting bonds issued and being cemented into place for the next several years when the numbers don't really merit it. And we don't have the numbers, and you say, let's spend a year getting data. But the problem is, for the last year and a half, the county has been completely unyielding and not being a good partner in terms of giving us numbers, having us at the table, modeling this in a way, even giving us a best and worst case scenario. They're just silent. So they're just not a good dance partner at this point. If there was some indication they'd be willing to be more appropriate, but the problem is we're locked in by our contract. We have no say, but we have to pay for any bad things that happen, whether it's because of a bad decision or just force majeure and act of God. We're stuck as a 40% partner, but with 0% management ability.
Mr. Chair, if I could just maybe help along, this is just a noticing decision. It's not, doesn't make a decision on what we actually do come July 1. We're going to notice in April. We're going to have a hearing in June, and we'll adopt in July. And we're going to have a meeting on the 17th about this. So this is just to make sure that we're covering our bases and not using additional reserves, and then just noticing that the final decisions could be made between now and June.
Councilmember Friedman.
So I appreciate your comments, Councilmember Dominguez, but I'm not comfortable. Again, the 8% is because we deferred it previously. That's why we are now. So I'm going to make a motion that we move forward with the staff recommendation to move forward with noticing at the proposals outlined by the report.
Second that motion. Any other discussion on the motion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. And matter carries 2-1.
Great.
And we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. you.